My name is Brittany Hartley, and I'm 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my father fired me from the family business I helped build and gave my job to his mistress. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "You built the system, but I own it." I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I just smiled and walked out. What he didn't know, what none of them understood, was that the system he thought he owned was the only thing keeping his company alive. Let me start from the beginning. Hartley Industrial Supply existed long before I could spell its name. My father, William Hartley, started it in 1994, the same year I was born. Back then, it was nothing more than a leaky warehouse in Ohio, a handful of machines, and two exhausted parents working 60-hour weeks just to survive. My mother ran the books. My father chased clients and barked orders on the production floor. I grew up between them, literally. Some kids remember playgrounds. I remember the smell of machine oil and overheated metal. I remember the rhythmic thud of CNC machines and the way the floor vibrated when production was running at full capacity. My mother used to set up a playpen in the corner of the office so she could process invoices while keeping an eye on me. When I got older, the machinist would hand me scrap bolts and washers to play with like toys. This place wasn't just my home. It was my inheritance, or so I was told. By the time I was 10, I was sweeping floors after school. At 13, I was organizing inventory. At 16, I could run machines better than some of the full-time employees. My father loved to brag about me at industry events. "That's my daughter," he'd say proudly. "She's going to take over this whole operation one day." I believed him. So when it came time for college, I didn't chase dreams. I chased responsibility. I chose computer science with a minor in business administration because I could see where manufacturing was heading. Automation, data, digital systems. I wanted to modernize the company. I wanted to make my parents proud. I wanted to prove I deserved the future that had been promised to me since childhood. I came back after graduation and walked into chaos. My mother had died 2 years earlier. Cancer. Fast. Brutal. And without her, everything fell apart. Paper records everywhere. Payroll spreadsheets riddled with errors. Orders lost. Clients invoiced incorrectly. Nobody realized how much she had been holding together until she was gone. I stayed late every night fixing what I could. For years. I rebuilt the company from the inside out. And quietly, without contracts, without recognition, I built the system that would eventually make my father rich. Back then, I thought sacrifice meant loyalty. I didn't realize it was just training. If my childhood was shaped by the warehouse floor, my adulthood was consumed by what no one could see. When I came back to Hartley Industrial full-time in 2015, the company looked functional on the surface. Orders went out. Machines ran. Employees clocked in and clocked out. My father strutted around like a man who believed survival equaled success. But underneath the business was rotting from inefficiency and neglect. Everything still ran on paper. Scheduling was scribbled on a whiteboard that had been erased and rewritten so many times, the surface was permanently stained gray. Payroll was calculated manually through tangled spreadsheets filled with copy-paste errors and formulas no one could explain. Inventory records contradicted themselves depending on which binder you checked. I found invoices mismatched to clients' shipments recorded twice and entire orders that had simply vanished from the system. It wasn't just disorganized, it was dangerous. One major audit, one compliance inspection, one large client asking the wrong questions, and the entire operation could have collapsed. I didn't complain, I didn't lecture, I just started fixing it. At first, I tried recommending off-the-shelf software, ERP systems, inventory platforms, scheduling tools. My father waved them off. Too expensive, too complicated, too much computer nonsense. So I stopped asking. Instead, I started building. At night, on my own laptop, in my apartment. What began as a simple database turned into something much larger. A system that understood how this company actually worked, not how some generic consultant thought it should. I designed it to track every bolt, every washer, every fastener, down to individual lot numbers. I built scheduling logic that balanced machine load maintenance windows and labor availability. I created automated quality control flags that caught defects before they reached clients. Payroll integrated directly with time tracking. Invoicing pulled from actual production data instead of guesses. Client histories were logged automatically, every order, every complaint, every adjustment. Real-time dashboards showed exactly what was happening on the floor minute by minute. I named it Hartley OS. When I finally presented it to my father, he stared at the screen like it was a magic trick. Rows of data, Graphs updating in real time. Systems talking to each other automatically. Looks fancy, he said, as long as it works. That was the highest praise he ever gave it. He never asked how it worked, never asked who maintained it, never asked what would happen if something went wrong. To him, the screen showed numbers, and the business made money. That was enough. Within 3 years of implementing Hartley OS, everything changed. Efficiency jumped nearly 40%. Labor costs dropped without layoffs because scheduling stopped wasting time. Errors disappeared. Clients noticed. Contracts grew. Revenue exploded from barely $3 million a year to over 11. Suddenly, my father was being invited to conferences, golfing with executives, giving interviews about how he'd modernized his business. He spoke confidently about digital transformation, about strategic systems, about embracing the future. I watched him take credit for work he couldn't explain. Occasionally, behind closed doors, he'd pat my shoulder and say, "Good job, sweetheart." Sweetheart. I told myself it didn't matter. This was a family business. We were building something together. Recognition would come later. Ownership would come later. That was how legacy worked. That belief kept me quiet longer than it should have. Because while I was building the nervous system of the company, my father was changing too. He started coming home late, smelling like perfume my mother never wore. He joined a gym, bought new clothes, took business trips that didn't line up with any meetings on the calendar. I noticed. I just didn't say anything. My father never reacted well to questions. Growing up, I learned quickly that challenging him led to lectures about respect and loyalty. So I told myself his personal life wasn't my business. My mother was gone. He was allowed to move on. I just didn't expect who he'd move on with. When he introduced Bridget Taylor at a company dinner, he called her his executive assistant. 34 years old, blonde, impeccably dressed. She clung to his arm like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. I didn't need proof, I knew. She didn't look at the business the way I did. She didn't see years of labor or people who had grown old on that floor. She saw assets, numbers, potential leverage. During dinner, she asked about profit margins, growth projections, expansion timelines, not with curiosity, with calculation. And that was the moment I understood something cold and uncomfortable. I had built the system that made this company valuable, but I had never built a system that protected me. Bridget Taylor didn't waste time pretending she knew her place. Within weeks of being introduced as my father's executive assistant, she began attending meetings that had nothing to do with administrative support. At first, I told myself it was temporary, a learning phase. Maybe my father was easing her into the business so she could better support him. That illusion lasted about a month. By the second month, she was speaking up during management discussions, confidently, incorrectly, and without hesitation. By the fourth, she had taken over communications with several of our largest clients, inserting herself into relationships I had spent years carefully building. By the sixth, she was sitting in a corner office that used to belong to our VP of Operations, redecorated with minimalist furniture and expensive artwork that had absolutely nothing to do with manufacturing. No one questioned it. My father beamed every time she spoke like a proud student watching his favorite teacher perform. She praised his instincts, his leadership, his vision. She told him things he desperately wanted to hear. And slowly, methodically, she began cutting me out. Decisions I used to be involved in were suddenly made behind closed doors. Meetings I was expected to attend were labeled executive level only. Financial reports I needed to maintain system integrity were suddenly restricted. When I asked questions, I was told not to worry, that everything was being handled. Handled by someone who didn't understand the systems she was manipulating. The first time I truly pushed back was over a supplier change. Bridget decided to switch our primary raw materials vendor to a company she claimed offered better strategic alignment. The procurement manager came to me quietly concerned. The new supplier's prices were higher, delivery times were longer, quality was inconsistent. When I ran the numbers through Hartley OS, the impact was obvious. We'd lose money. I brought it to my father carefully, respectfully. "I'm not sure Bridget has enough operational background to be making procurement decisions alone," I said. "Maybe we should loop in someone from production or finance before finalizing these contracts." The reaction was immediate. My father's face turned red. His jaw tightened the way it always did before he started yelling. "Bridget has a business degree and 15 years of corporate experience," he snapped. "She knows what she's doing. Maybe you should focus on your computer work and let the adults handle business decisions." The adults. I was 30 years old. I had built the system running his company. I had sacrificed my 20s to keep his legacy alive. And in that moment, I understood my position clearly. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't an heir. I was labor. Over the next year, Bridget's influence became absolute. She replaced our accountant with someone she trusted. She overrode scheduling recommendations generated by the system because they didn't match her intuition. She fired 2 long-term employees for underperformance based on metrics she didn't understand. She reassigned projects I was leading to consultants from her personal network. And my father let her. I watched him smile while she dismantled the structure I had built. I watched him nod while she rewrote the company around herself. I watched him choose her again and again without ever asking me how this would affect the business. I should have left then. Instead, I stayed. Because part of me still believed blood mattered. That the years I had poured into Hartley Industrial meant something. That my father would eventually see what was happening. Then Bridget hired a new IT consultant. Without telling me. He showed up one Monday morning, mid-20s, polished shoes, preppy confidence, asking questions about our network infrastructure, like he was touring a museum exhibit. Bridget introduced him as Trevor, explaining they were exploring optimization opportunities. I explained calmly that I had designed and maintained the entire system, that optimization without my involvement was impossible. Bridget smiled at me, like you smile at a child who just said something naive. That's exactly why we need redundancy, she said. What if something happened to you? The company can't depend on one person. That was the moment I stopped feeling surprised, because I finally understood the plan. She wasn't building redundancy. She was replacing me. Once you see the knife, you stop wondering why your back hurts. After Trevor arrived, my days became a careful performance. I answered his questions. I walked him through surface-level architecture. I explained workflows in neutral professional language. I even smiled when Bridget hovered nearby, pretending to supervise conversations she didn't understand. But inside, something had shifted. For the first time since I was a child, sweeping floors in that warehouse, I stopped thinking like a daughter and started thinking like a woman who needed to survive. Trevor asked a lot of questions. Network diagrams, server locations, backup schedules, vendor contacts. I gave him everything that would look reasonable in a handover, non-critical credentials, general system maps, documentation anyone with patience could piece together. What I didn't give him was the heart. Hartley OS wasn't like the other systems he'd worked on. It wasn't modular in the way off-the-shelf software was. It wasn't documented because no one had ever cared enough to ask. It was living architecture, written over years, evolving with the company. And at its core was something Trevor couldn't see: layered encryption rolling. Authentication protocols and administrative verification cycles that required keys I never stored on company servers. Keys that existed only in my possession. Here's the part my father never understood, never bothered to understand. I built Hartley OS on my own time, on my own equipment, before it was ever deployed at the company. When I brought it in, there was no work-for-hire agreement, no intellectual property assignment, no lawyer involved. I'd actually suggested formalizing ownership once years ago. My father waved it off. "We don't need paperwork in a family business," he'd said. "You're my daughter. This is your company too." Those words echoed in my head every time Trevor asked about source code access. Every time Bridget smiled and talked about continuity. Every time my father looked at me like I was just another department head instead of the person who built his empire. I checked my employment contract late one night, sitting alone in my apartment. Read it 3 times. There was nothing about software ownership, nothing about IP transfer, nothing about proprietary systems. Hartley OS was mine. That knowledge didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel tired. Because owning it meant I had been naive. It meant I had trusted people who saw my loyalty as leverage. It meant that when the moment came and I could feel it coming, I would have to choose between protecting myself and protecting people who had already decided I was expendable. The final confirmation came 3 weeks later. My father called me into his office for what he called an important meeting about the company's future direction. His tone was formal, unfamiliar. Bridget was already there when I arrived, seated comfortably, legs crossed, phone face down on the desk, like she owned the room. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. That should have been enough warning. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were termination documents. Official, clean, final. "We're restructuring," he said. "The COO role is being eliminated. We're consolidating operations under a chief administrative officer position. Bridget will be taking over." The words didn't land immediately. They floated in the air, absurd, weightless. You're firing me, I asked. It's not personal, he replied quickly. Just business. 8 years of my life, my mother's legacy, the system that made his company viable. Not personal. I looked at Bridget. She smiled just barely. What about the systems, I asked. Hartley OS. Who's maintaining it? Bridget answered before my father could. Trevor will be handling all IT operations going forward. I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded. Okay, I said. I'll prepare documentation. My father relaxed visibly. Bridget was already typing on her phone, probably updating someone about her promotion. Neither of them noticed that I wasn't angry. I was already gone. The strange thing about betrayal is that it doesn't always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it's quiet, procedural, printed in black ink on white paper slid across a desk by someone who refuses to look you in the eye. I took the folder home that night and didn't open it right away. I already knew what it said. The words had been spoken. The paper was just theater. Over the next 3 days, I became exactly what they expected me to be. Professional, cooperative, calm. I showed up on time. I smiled in the hallways. I asked Trevor what documentation he needed and encouraged him to send me a list so I wouldn't miss anything important. He sent back 42 questions, most of them basic. Network topology, server locations, backup schedules, vendor contacts. I answered every single one, thoroughly, clearly, patiently. I walked him through interfaces, showed him how to run reports, how to check system health, how to interpret dashboards without breaking anything. I even created training slides, the kind consultants charge obscene amounts of money for, just to make sure no one could accuse me of being difficult. What I didn't give him, what I never intended to give him, was the core. Because Hartley OS wasn't just software, it was a lock, and I held the keys. On my last day, HR scheduled an exit interview. Standard procedure. They handed me a severance agreement and a non-disclosure form. I read every word, signed everything. There was no mention of intellectual property, no claim to source code, no demand for access credentials beyond company-owned systems. My father had never bothered to involve a lawyer when it mattered. Afterward, I walked the floor one last time. I hugged Janet, the floor supervisor, who had been there longer than I'd been alive. She didn't know what was coming. None of them did. Paul from Accounts Receivable brought donuts like he always did on Fridays. Carol from HR gave me a tight smile that said she knew this was wrong, but didn't have the power to stop it. I felt sick, but I kept walking. In the parking lot, Bridget intercepted me. Her heels clicked sharply against the asphalt, deliberate, confident. No hard feelings, right, Brittany, she said. This is just business. I looked at her, the woman who had dismantled my role, my future, my family, and smiled. No hard feelings at all, I said. I hope everything works out exactly the way you deserve. She laughed satisfied and walked away. That night, I went home, turned off my phone, and slept better than I had in months. The first call came Monday morning. It was Janet. She sounded panicked. Brittany, I know you don't work here anymore, but the production schedules won't load. Machines aren't starting their automated sequences. Trevor's been trying all morning. I told her gently that I was no longer employed by Hartley Industrial and that she should contact the new IT director. The second call came an hour later. Then another. Then another. Invoicing frozen. Inventory screens blank. Quality control logs inaccessible. Automated ordering stalled. Hartley OS hadn't failed. It had protected itself. 72 hours without administrative verification triggered a full lockdown, an internal security feature I'd built years ago to protect against ransomware or intrusion. All operational data encrypted. All core functions inaccessible. By Wednesday, my father started calling. I let every call go to voicemail. His messages changed tone quickly. Friendly, then anxious, then furious, then threatening. By Thursday, Bridget called from an unknown number. Payroll is due tomorrow, she said, her voice tight with panic. 65 people are expecting paychecks. That sounds like a problem for your IT director, I replied calmly. You're being unreasonable. No, I said, I'm respecting your restructuring. She threatened lawsuits, arrest, industry blacklisting. I told her I looked forward to explaining intellectual property law in court. On Friday, payroll bounced. By Monday, the company was bleeding. And for the first time in my life, I stopped carrying the weight of saving it. By the end of the first week, Hartley Industrial wasn't just malfunctioning. It was unraveling. Without Hartley, OS nothing spoke to anything else. The machines could still run manually, but no one knew what to run. Inventory counts were guesses. Production schedules conflicted. Orders duplicated or disappeared entirely. Quality control logs were locked behind encrypted layers no one could access. People were working but blindly. I found out most of this secondhand. Former coworkers called not to accuse, but to ask, to understand, to figure out how something so stable could collapse so fast. I told them the truth carefully. I had been terminated. The company had not secured proper system access or transition. I was legally unable to assist without a formal agreement. Some of them were angry. Most were scared. By Tuesday, clients noticed. Orders weren't confirmed. Delivery timelines slipped. One of our largest aerospace clients paused shipments entirely, citing operational uncertainty. That single pause represented nearly 30% of the company's annual revenue. By Wednesday, my father stopped pretending. He called 11 times, left voicemails that swung between pleading and rage. "Brittany, this is getting out of hand. We're willing to pay consulting rates. You're sabotaging your own family. I will have you arrested." I saved every message. Documentation matters. On Thursday, the state labor board got involved. Missed payroll triggered formal complaints. Inspectors arrived asking for employment records, payment histories, compliance documentation. All of it was locked inside Hartley OS. Emergency accounting firms were hired to reconstruct data manually from bank statements and paper stubs. The cost climbed into tens of thousands within days. And then the cracks in Bridget's story began to show. Without the system masking inconsistencies, financial irregularities surfaced. Small transfers at first, then larger ones. Money moved into accounts that didn't belong to the company. My father confronted her. There was yelling, accusations, denial, then silence. Bridget left that same afternoon. She packed her office artwork, furniture, ambition, and walked out without saying goodbye. Later, I heard she'd already moved in with someone else. Another business, another target. By then, Hartley Industrial had lost 3 clients. 12 employees quit. The production floor dropped from 3 shifts to 1. And finally, my father called me without anger. His voice sounded older, smaller. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he said. "You're destroying everything." I let him speak, then I answered, "You destroyed it when you decided I was disposable." Silence stretched between us. "What do you want?" he asked. "I didn't want revenge. I didn't want control. I want you to understand," I said, "and I want the truth on paper." A week later, his lawyer called. The call from my father's lawyer came on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where everything feels muted, as if the world is holding its breath. He spoke carefully, too carefully. Hartley Industrial wanted to resolve the matter amicably. They proposed a licensing agreement for Hartley OS and requested my cooperation to restore operations. In exchange, they offered a one-time payment that barely acknowledged the years the system had powered the company. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed what I already knew. Even now, even with the company bleeding, my father still believed he was negotiating from a position of strength. I countered with terms that reflected reality compensation for past use, monthly licensing fees going forward, formal recognition as the system's creator, and full legal acknowledgement that Hartley OS was my intellectual property. There was one more condition I almost added, an apology, but I didn't, because I already knew he wouldn't give it. While the lawyers exchanged letters, the company continued to deteriorate. The aerospace client terminated their contract completely. 2 more followed. Word spread quickly in our industry, quietly, efficiently, that Hartley Industrial was no longer reliable. Suppliers tightened terms, banks asked questions, insurance providers reviewed risk exposure. My father called me once during that period not to negotiate, but to guilt me. "Your mother helped build this company," he said. "She'd be ashamed of what you're doing." That one hurt, but it also clarified something I'd been avoiding my entire life. My mother built this company with love. My father ran it with control. I responded calmly. "I gave you 8 years. You gave my job to your girlfriend. This is the consequence of that decision." He didn't argue. He couldn't. The settlement came together quickly after that. $150,000 up front, $3,000 monthly licensing fees, formal credit as the creator of Hartley OS. No apology. We signed without meeting. Just signatures. Wire transfers. Clean lines drawn where family used to be. The next morning, I drove to the facility one last time, not to gloat, not to confront, but to finish what I'd started. I spent 4 hours with Trevor. This time I showed him everything. The real architecture, the encryption layers, the administrative cycles, the documentation I'd never been asked for, never been allowed to provide. He listened, took notes, apologized. "I didn't know," he said quietly. I believed him. When I finished, I walked out without looking for my father. Some conversations are no longer worth having. 2 months after the settlement, Hartley Industrial was still standing. Barely. The company that once pulled in over $11 million a year was struggling to clear 4. Too many clients had walked away. Too many employees had quit. Too much trust had been burned to rebuild quickly. My father sold off equipment to cover operating costs and downsized production to a single shift. The warehouse that once hummed with activity now felt hollow, like a body missing its heartbeat. I didn't go back to see it. I didn't need to. Every month on the first business day, the licensing payment hit my account. No note, no message, just the money, precise and silent, like a clock ticking in the background of a life that no longer included me. And I was fine with that. I used part of the settlement to start my own company, Hartley Systems. I kept the name deliberately. My mother had been a Hartley too. She was the one who believed in me before the revenue numbers, before the dashboards, before anyone knew what automation meant. If anyone deserved to have that name attached to something built right, it was her. This time I did everything differently. Contracts, documentation, teams instead of single points of failure. A system designed to be understood, maintained, and respected, not hoarded or ignored. I took everything I'd learned, the technical lessons, and the painful personal ones, and built something better. Within weeks, 3 manufacturing companies signed letters of intent. 2 were former Hartley Industrial clients who reached out quietly, carefully, asking if the stories were true. They were. I hired my first employee a month later. Janet. My father had laid her off when he cut the 3rd shift. She showed up to my small office on her first day wearing the same steel-toed boots she'd worn for decades, looked around, and smiled. "It feels good," she said, "working for someone who actually notices." That made everything worth it. I haven't spoken to my father since that last phone call. He doesn't reach out. I don't expect him to. We exist in parallel now, connected only by a contract and the quiet acknowledgement of what he lost. I don't hate him. I just don't carry him anymore. Because the truth is this: I didn't destroy the family business. I revealed what it was built on. And when it came time to choose between loyalty and survival, I finally chose myself.